The Ant and the Maiden, the mythical world of Aegina. Athens, Thebes, Corinth, Delphi, Olympia. These places evoke mythological sagas from Oedipus to Heracles, Apollo to Aphrodite. But few outside the world of classics have heard of the island of Aegina or understand its rich mythological traditions. In part, this is because of Athens. The Athenians hated and feared the people of Aegina because of the power of its navy and its strategic position in the Saronic Gulf. There was no love lost between the two sides. The Greek historian Herodotus details a number of battles between the two city-states in the course of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, and I'll speak about a couple more in detail during this talk. There is even doubt about which side was bravest at the Battle of Salamis against the Persians. The Athenian leader Pericles called Aegina the eyesore of the Piraeus, and led sorties against Aegina to abolish its power once and for all. Athenian actions against Aegina in the 5th century BCE decimated the Aeginetan navy in 458 BCE, and much of its population was expelled in 431, with the subsequent establishment of an Athenian colony on Aegina. Even that was not enough for the vengeful Athenians, and like hyenas stripping the bones of a carcass, they found an excuse to exterminate many of those survivors in the coming decades during the Peloponnesian War. As a polis, Aegina never reached the heights it had achieved during the 6th and early 5th century BCE ever again. I'm going to speak about the mythological stories of Aegina and discuss not only how they were used by the people of Aegina during their period of naval dominance, but also how those myths were ultimately appropriated by the Athenians. Aeginetan myths promulgated an image of Panhellenic importance, hospitality, power, and prestige. They connected the current inhabitants of the island to famous descendants including Achilles and Ajax, and set themselves apart as an oligarchic, mercantile, Doric, and seafaring society. Most Doric states were land powers like Sparta and were not known for their exploration and commerce. There are also some surprising ways in which the myths were explained by mythographers and later scholars that I will share to shed light on the image this polis created for itself. Poetry was important in this regard, especially the Epinetian poetry of Pindar, who sang songs honoring the victorious athletes of the island and often tied their exploits to their mythological predecessors. These myths were also important for cult, and I'll speak about how the temples and religious rituals helped to reinforce belief in Aeginetan exceptionalism. This talk, then, aims to not only provide a glimpse into the way one city-state utilized myth for self-expression and national pride, but also how it was subsequently beaten at its own game by another city-state, that be Athens. We can see a propaganda war with mythology and cult as a type of soft power that is wielded by the city-states. A final coda will explain a Roman poet's use of Aeginetan myth for his own purposes, that's Ovid, and possible implications for Rome itself. From archaeological remains, we can see that Aegina had been inhabited during the Mycenaean period and seems to have had contact with Crete. Some of the oldest cult spaces on the island have figurines and pottery from that era. For instance, the Temple of Aphaea sits on ground that shows continuity of cult from the 14th century BCE. Aphaea seems to have been a fertility goddess at first and important for rites of passage of young men and women, but we'll see that she undergoes changes as the island develops, accruing additional stories and syncretism with figures such as Dictina, Artemis, and Athena. Her temple in some ways mirrors the fortunes of the polis, attaining monumental size and decoration at the beginning of the Persian Wars, when Aegina was vying with Athens for control of the Saronic Gulf. The earliest shrine, however, was to Zeus Helanios, which allows us to delve into the myths that the Aeginetans were keen to stress to the broader Hellenic world. This late Bronze Age mountaintop shrine consists of a terraced area to support buildings and a performance space with an ash altar at its peak honoring Zeus. Mount Oros is the highest peak on any of the Saronic Gulf islands and has a commanding view of the Gulf, the western coast of Attica, and even the Bay of Athens on a clear day. Pausanias, a sort of ancient Greek Rick Steves, tells us that this shrine honored Aeacus and his father Zeus, and that Aeacus came to this place to beg for rain from a prolonged drought that hit Greece in mythical times. He did this on behalf of various Greek embassies that thought, well, who better to ask than the son of Zeus? And its success led to its Panhellenic fame. It's notable that rituals on this peak have continued to the current day, as Salavura notes, quote, "The observation made since ancient times that if a cloud settles on the temple of Zeus Hellenios on Aegina, then usually rain follows on the dry island, in Megara, and in Attica, would not have escaped the attention of prehistoric farmers and breeders. Until recently, in times of great drought, which are not rare, the Aeginetans carried the Virgin Mary's image in procession to the Greek Orthodox Church that you can see in this video." Zeus is associated with the island because he carried the nymph Aegina, who was originally from the area of Thebes, to this spot, and this is where she gave birth to the hero Aeacus. Aegina was the daughter of Aesopus, a river god associated with Thebes, and we read about her abduction and the famous line sprung from her in Pindar's Isthmian 8. Now I have to pause here for a second to tell you about Pindar. Pindar is a fabulous but fabulously difficult poet who wrote lyric poems celebrating victorious athletes at the games in Greece, Olympic, Pythian, etc. He wrote more poems for victors from Aegina than any other polis, and always touts the honest dealings, the physical prowess, and strong familial structure of the Aeginetans. He was a poet for hire, and these poems would have been performed in Aegina or sometimes at Delphi, at Olympia, or other locations. And this was the equivalent of having a hit song written about you. A poem by Pindar gave you pan-Hellenic kleos, glory, and Pindar provides evidence of the way the Aeginetans liked to think of themselves during the period in which Aegina and Athens were especially at one another's throats. So that passage from Isthmian 8 goes as follows. "A man must cherish good hope, and one raised in seven-gated Thebes must offer the choicest gift of the graces to Aegina, because Aegina and Thebe were twins, the youngest daughters of their father Aesopus, and they found favor with King Zeus, who established one beside the beautiful stream of Dirce to dwell as mistress of a chariot-loving city. But you, Aegina, he brought to the island of Oenopeia and slept with you, and there you bore divine Aeacus, dearest of mortals to his loud thundering father, a man who settles disputes even for the gods." According to the Greek poet Hesiod, Aeacus was lonely when he grew up. He and his mother were the only ones on this island. Zeus decided to help him by turning the ants of the island into young men to be his playmates and his subjects. The metamorphosis will strike Ovid as particularly notable, and he spends time in his epic poem, Metamorphoses, delineating their transformations. The idea that the people are in some way sprung from the soil, or autochthonous, runs through many Greek foundation myths from Athens to Thebes. These ant-men, the myrmidons, are tied etymologically to ants, a myrmex, and also, according to Ovid, have the same hard-working, all-for-one and one-for-all attitude that ants embody. Greg Nage notes that anthropogenic myths about autochthonous populations generated from colonies of ants or termites are attested in a variety of cultures that have no historic or prehistoric connections with the ancient Greeks, especially in Africa. So we can see this as a common theme in mythology. Thus, the native population of Aegina had always been there and were sprung from the soil itself. Of course, in antiquity as today, there were naysayers and rationalizers of such mythical ideas. One such individual is Strabo, a Greek geographer writing under the Emperor Augustus. He says the following: "The land has soil at a certain depth, but it's stony at the surface, particularly the plain country, whence the whole has a barren appearance, but yields yet large crops of barley." It is said that the Aeginetans were called Myrmidones, not as the fable accounts for the name when the ants were transformed into men at the time of a great famine, but because by digging, like ants, they threw up the earth upon the rocks and were thus able to cultivate the ground, and because they lived in excavations underground, abstaining from the use of bricks and sparing of the soil for this purpose. So, no ants, but Strabo says that the story came to be because the people lived in adobe or dugout dwellings in the earth. One may wonder if Strabo got this idea from the material remains of the capital city, namely the system of water channels dug in the 6th century BCE to the spring house of the city. These underground tunnels could have evoked the works of ants for someone like Strabo, who came upon them centuries later when they were no longer in use. This strong nativist sentiment, i.e., we've always lived on this land, is interesting in a mercantile sea power that also has numerous connections to migration through its mythology. Two of Aeacus' sons, Telamon and Peleus, are exiled from the island for killing their brother Phocus, although they claim it was an accident. Thus Telamon ends up moving to Salamis, and Peleus becomes associated with Thessaly. Aeginetans would then be able to assert that Aegina had some natural claim over those areas, or at the very least, certain cultural ties with these areas as well. Other stories about Aeacus include his just dealings, also indicative of the people of Aegina and their role as traders who wanted to seem like honest businessmen, and afterwards Aeacus becomes one of the judges of the underworld. In Pindar, he helped the gods build the walls of Troy, and it was the spot that he built that was able to be taken later by his sons and grandson Achilles, or great-grandson Neoptolemus. Aeacus and his family thus are important for the island of Aegina. Aeacus was to Aegina what Apollo was to Delphi, essentially. Cult associated with them was centered on an Iakion near the harbor of Aegina. This cult center, which has not survived, housed small cult statues of Aeacus, his sons, and possibly even his grandsons. What is certain is that these cult statues were portable and were employed as totems that had real power. For instance, during a border feud between Athens and Thebes, the Thebans asked for help from Aegina. In response, the Aeginetans sent these statues, and I think we have to take seriously that they thought these could help. The numinous quality of these statues would somehow imbue the Thebans with the martial valor of an Achilles or a Telamon. When, however, the Thebans were routed in battle, they sent back the statues and said, "Send us men this time." Now, this story, which is from Herodotus, helps us to see how important the myths surrounding Aeacus were to the people of Aegina. And it also strengthens the links between Thebes and Aegina. Remember, the nymphs Thebe and Aegina were twin sisters. Myth can be used to tie together city-states in the very real theater of war. The Theban connections with Aeacus and the antagonisms between Thebes and Athens at the end of the 6th century dragged Aegina into more direct conflict with Athens. This involved raids on the Attic coast by Aegina and attempted counterattacks by the Athenians. It was at that period, right around 500 BCE, when Athenians built their own Iakion, their own shrine to Aeacus. Oh, no, you don't. Yes, the Athenians were told by the Oracle of Delphi that if they really wanted to get back at the Aeginetans, they should build a temple and then wait for 30 years. But the Athenians, notorious busybodies that they are, instead built a structure in honor of Aeacus and immediately commenced hostilities. This idea of claiming heroes or appropriating gods was not uncommon in the ancient world, but this seems like a particularly daring attempt on behalf of the Athenians. Unfortunately, little remains of the building beyond foundations and one-column capital, but it seems like it was used to store grain in the 4th century BCE, and that verdicts in court cases were inscribed on the walls, and one might think of Aeacus as judge as a reason why those court verdicts were inscribed on the walls. Control of one's mythology is important, then, for the way one will be seen, and in Aeacus the Aeginetans had a founder sprung from Zeus with magical earth-born followers and a productive family line involving heroes of the highest caliber. Myth has power, and yet it is mutable in terms of who could take ownership and control the interpretation of the myth. This narrative, if you will, continued in the monumental architecture of the Temple of Aphaea. Although the temple honored a local goddess, Aphaea, we can see how it was transformed into a larger, more brilliantly painted pan-Hellenic billboard for Aeginetan interests. The Temenos, that's the holy area, gradually grew in the 6th century, but the previous temple came to an abrupt end with a fire around 500 BCE. In the next 20 years, during the period of the Heraldless War between Aegina and Athens, a new monumental temple was built of limestone with splendid Parian marble pedamental sculptures. These were painted in bright colors. One of these, on the east, must have been damaged, or something happened, and so a new one was sculpted. The two that survive, primarily in Munich's Glyptothek, would have been on the temple at the same time, and they have been a boon to art historians because they clearly show the transition from an archaic style to a more classical style, and we can see that in this video. The scenes are from two separate attacks on Troy that involve descendants of Aeacus. On the west pediment, we can see Paris in his brilliantly colored outfit, and know it was the sack of Troy detailed in Homer, with Achilles and Ajax involved. We see Heracles on the east pediment and know that Telamon was present with him during his sack of Troy. Greece versus the east, but this artistic program concentrates on the family line of Aeacus, that is, Aegina, and that makes sense at this time. After all, the Persian Wars begin with the Battle of Marathon in 490 and then continued with Xerxes' invasion in 480. Aegina, at this time, is at the apogee of its power, and its navy is the match of anybody's. The elevation of the story of Telamon and Heracles in their attack on Troy is unusual. This is the first major monumental sculptural project devoted to it, and it is in the place of honor, the east side that faces the altar. There is a strong identification between both sides, which makes the tale of Telamon's sack of Troy equivalent to the Homeric attack against Priam's Troy. Aegina is flexing her muscle here with these military scenes and showing its continued heroism versus Eastern enemies. The big question for me is, why have Athena in the center of both of these? Well, some scholars believe it is because the goddess Aphaea was now being identified with Athena. I think there's something more political involved here. Just as the Athenians had built a new Iakion to try to win support of the heroes and associate themselves with that mythical family, now the Aeginetans were trying to claim Athena as a goddess who supported Aegina and her famous royal family throughout the ages. Even the form of the striding Athena with her aegis outstretched seems to mimic that of the Athena found on the old temple of Athena Polias from Athens. Essentially, the Aeginetans were claiming through this temple that Athena shouldn't be the goddess of Athens, but should be a goddess for Aegina first and foremost. This temple was the most impressive of the area in 480. Remember that the original Parthenon had been burnt down by the Persians. So why not have Athena move in? The fact that these styles of sculpture as well would both be looking backwards to the Archaic Age as well as forward to the Classical period could show that she has been our goddess in the past and will continue to be our goddess from an Aeginetan point of view. This plays into the larger soft power of mythology that I've been tracing in this talk, and highlights how Athena can be claimed as one of our own by Aegina as a direct response to the Iakion in Athens and increased tensions between the two city-states. While this bold move seems to have failed in light of Athenian victories against Aegina in the 450s BCE, we can see how claims of divine support and the myths that attended a people continue to resonate throughout antiquity. These myths can also change. Aeginetans would have been shocked to see that by Ovid's time, 500 years later, Aegina is made into a fierce ally of Athens in a mythological war against King Minos of Crete. In the Metamorphoses, Ovid's Aeacus tells of a plague that hit Aegina and led to the Ant-Men being created, but that plague eerily resembles the historical plague that hit Athens itself during the Peloponnesian War. So Aegina and Athens are somehow combined into one for Ovid. Now both ancient populations are rolling in their graves, and they act as a stand-in for Rome in some tangible manner. Ovid's own transformation of the historical details in the mythological stories act to lessen the individuality of these city-states and make them good to think with by a Roman poet who worries about homogeneity and blind obedience to power. The myths of an island like Aegina can tell us much about myths more broadly in the ancient world. The PR opportunities involved in myth, and especially good poetry or impressive architecture and art expressing those myths, could be important for the self-definition of a people and the delineation of their values. I'll conclude with another quotation of Pindar about Aegina, showing how this island wanted to see itself in the eyes of the world. Island, whose name is famous indeed, you live and rule in the Dorian sea, O shining star of Zeus Holanios. Therefore we shall not put you to bed without a banquet of poems. Rather, as you receive waves of songs, you will recount where you got your ship-ruling fortune and that virtue of just regard for strangers. Truly, the far-seeing son of Kronos, who accomplishes all things, both this and that, has bestowed prosperity on you. The end.